Popular History of Ireland from the Earliest Period to the Emancipation of the Catholics, Book 1, by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Chapter 6, Kings of the 7th Century. The 5 years of the 6th century which remained after the death of Hugh II were filled by Hugh III, son of Dermid the semi-pagan. Hugh IV succeeded A.D. 599 and reigned for several years. 2 other kings of small account reigned 7 years. Donald II, A.D. 624, reigned 16 years. Conall and Kellogg, brothers, A.D. 640, reigned jointly 16 years. They were succeeded, A.D. 656, by Dermid and Blothmock, brothers, who reigned jointly 7 years. Shinasag, son of the former, reigned 6 years. Kinfala, 4. Finachta, the hospitable, 20 years. And Loingsec, A.D. 693, 8 years. Throughout this century, the power of the Church was constantly on the increase and is visible in many important changes. The last armed struggle of Druidism and the only invasion of Ireland by the Anglo-Saxons are also events of the civil history of the 7th century. The reign of Donald II is notable for the passing away of most of those saintly men, the second generation of Irish abbots and bishops, for the foundation of the celebrated school of Lismore on the Munster Blackwater, and the Battle of Moira in the present county of Down. Of the school and the saints we shall speak hereafter. The battle deserves more immediate mention. The cause of the battle was the pretension of the petty Prince of Ulidia, which comprised little more than the present county of Down, to be recognized as Prince of all Ulster. Now the High Nial family not only had long given monarchs to all Ireland, but had also the lion's share of their own province, and King Donald as their head could not permit their ascendancy to be disputed. The ancestors of the present pretender, Congal, surnamed the Squint-eyed, had twice received and cherished the licentious bards when under the ban of Tara, and his popularity with that still powerful order was one prop of his ambition. It is pretty clear also that the last rally of Druidism against Christianity took place behind his banner on the plain of Moira. It was the year 637, and preparations had long gone on both sides for a final trial of strength. Congal had recruited numerous bands of Saxons, Britons, Picts, and Argyll Scots, who poured into the larbours of Down for months, and were marshalled on the banks of the Lagan to sustain his cause. The poets of succeeding ages have dwelt much in detail on the occurrences of this memorable day. It was what might strictly be called a pitched battle, time and place being fixed by mutual agreement. King Donald was accompanied by his bard, who described to him, as they came in sight, the several standards of Congal's host, and who served under them. Conspicuous above all, the ancient banner of the Red Branch Knights, a yellow lion wrought on green satin, floated over Congal's host. On the other side, the monarch commanded in person, accompanied by his kinsmen, the sons of Hugh III. The red hand of Tyrwin, the cross of Tyrconnell, the eagle and lion of Inishowen, the axes of Fanad, were in his ranks, ranged closely round his own standard. The cause of the Constitution and the Church prevailed, and Druidism mourned its last hope extinguished on the plains of Moira, in the death of Congal and the defeat of his vast army. King Donald returned in triumph to celebrate his victory at Emania and to receive the benediction of the Church at Armagh. The sons of Hugh III, Dermid and Blothmock, zealous and pious Christian princes, survived the field of Moira and other days of danger, and finally attained the supreme power, A.D. 656. Like the 2 kings of Sparta, they reigned jointly, dividing between them the labors and cares of state. In their reign, that terrible scourge, called in Irish the Yellow Plague, after ravaging a great part of Britain, broke out with undiminished virulence in Erin, AD 664. To heighten the awful sense of inevitable doom, an eclipse of the sun occurred concurrently with the appearance of the pestilence on the first Sunday in May. It was the season when the ancient sun god had been accustomed to receive his annual oblations, and we can well believe that those whose hearts still trembled at the name of Bel must have connected the eclipse and the plague with the revolution in the national worship, and the overthrow of the ancient gods on that plain of prostration, where they had so long received the homage of an entire people. Among the victims of this fearful visitation, which, like the modern cholera, swept through all ranks and classes of society, and returned in the same track for several successive seasons, were very many of those venerated men, the third and fourth generation of the abbots and bishops. The Munster king and many of the chieftain class shared the common lot. Lastly, the royal brothers fell themselves victims to the epidemic, which so sadly signalizes their reign. The only conflicts that occurred on Irish soil with a Pictish or an Anglo-Saxon force, if we accept those who formed a contingent of Congal's army at Moira, occurred in the time of the hospitable Finachta. The Pictish force, with their leaders, were totally defeated at Rathmore in Antrim, AD 680. But the Anglo-Saxon expedition, AD 684, seems not to have been either expected or guarded against. As leading to the mention of other interesting events, we must set this inroad clearly before the reader. The Saxons had now been for 4 centuries in Britain, the older inhabitants of which, Celts, like the Gauls and Irish, they had cruelly harassed, just as the Milesian Irish oppressed their Belgic predecessors, and as the Normans, in turn, will be found oppressing both Celt and Saxon in England and Ireland. Britain had been divided by the Saxon leaders into 8 separate kingdoms, the people and princes of several of which were converted to Christianity in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, though some of them did not receive the gospel before the beginning of the 8th. The Saxons of Kent and the southern kingdoms generally were converted by missionaries from France or Rome, or native preachers of the first or second Christian generation. Those of Northumbria recognize as their apostles St. Aidan and St. Cuthbert, 2 fathers from Iona. The kingdom of Northumbria, as the name implies, embraced nearly all the country from the Humber to the Pictish border. York was its capital and the seat of its ecclesiastical primacy, where, at the time we speak of, the illustrious Wilfrid was maintaining, with a willful and unscrupulous king, a struggle not unlike that which Becket maintained with Henry II. This prince, Egfrid by name, was constantly engaged in wars with his Saxon contemporaries, or the Picts and Scots. In the summer of 683 he sent an expedition under the command of Bjort, one of his earls, to ravage the coast of Leinster. Bjort landed probably in the Boyne and swept over the rich plain of Meath with fire and sword, burning churches, driving off herds and flocks, and slaughtering the clergy and the husbandmen. The piety of an after age saw in the retribution which overtook Egfrid the following year, when he was slain by the Picts and Scots, the judgment of heaven, avenging the unprovoked wrongs of the Irish. His Scottish conquerors, returning good for evil, carried his body to Iona, where it was interred with all due honor. Iona was now in the zenith of its glory. The barren rock, about 3 miles in length, was covered with monastic buildings, and its cemetery was already adorned with the tombs of saints and kings. 5 successors of Columcille slept in peace around their holy founder, and a 6th, equal in learning and sanctity to any who preceded him, received the remains of King Egfrid from the hands of his conquerors. This was Abbot Adamnan, to whom Ireland and Scotland are equally indebted for his admirable writings, and who might also dispute with Bede himself the title of Father of British History. Adamnan regarded the fate of Egfrid, we may be sure, in the light of a judgment on him for his misdeeds, as Bede and British Christians very generally did. He learned, too, that there were in Northumbria several Christian captives, carried off in Bjort's expedition and probably sold into slavery. Now every missionary that ever went out from Iona had taught that to reduce Christians to slavery was wholly inconsistent with a belief in the doctrines of the gospel. St. Aidan, the apostle of Northumbria, had refused the late Egfrid's father's absolution on one occasion until he solemnly promised to restore their freedom to certain captives of this description. In the same spirit, Adamnan voluntarily undertook a journey to York, where Aldfrid, a prince educated in Ireland and whose itinerary of Ireland we still have, now reigned. The Abbot of Iona succeeded in his humane mission, and crossing over to his native land, he restored 60 of the captives to their homes and kindred. While the liberated exiles rejoiced on the plain of Meath, the tent of the Abbot of Iona was pitched on the Rath of Tara, a fact which would seem to indicate that already, in little more than a century since the interdict had fallen on it, the edifices which made so fine a show in the days of Patrick were ruined and uninhabitable. Either at Tara or some of the royal residences, Adamnan on this visit procured the passing of a law, A.D. 684, forbidding women to accompany an army to battle, or to engage personally in the conflict. The mild maternal genius of Christianity is faithfully exhibited in such a law, which consummates the glory of the worthy successor of Columcille. It is curious here to observe that it was not until another 100 years had passed, not till the beginning of the 9th century, that the clergy were exempt from military service. So slow and patient is the process by which Christianity infuses itself into the social life of a converted people. The long reign of Finacta, the hospitable, who may, for his many other virtues, be also called the pious, was rendered farther remarkable in the annals of the country by the formal abandonment of the special tax, so long levied upon, and so long and desperately resisted by, the men of Leinster. The all-powerful intercessor in this case was St. Moling, of the royal house of Leinster, and Bishop of Fernamore, now Feuds. In the early part of his reign, Finacta seems not to have been disposed to collect this invidious tax by force, but yielding to other motives, he afterwards took a different view of his duty, and marched into Leinster to compel its payment. Here the holy prelate of Feuds met him, and related a vision in which he had been instructed to demand the abolition of the impost. The abolition, he contended, should not be simply a suspension, but final and forever. The tribute was, at this period, enormous, 15,000 head of cattle annually. The decision must have been made about the time that Abbot Adamnan was in Ireland, A.D. 684, and that illustrious personage is said to have been opposed to the abolition. Abolished it was, and though its reenactment was often attempted, the authority of St. Molling's solemn settlement prevented it from being reinforced for any length of time, except as a political or military infliction. Finacta fell in battle in the 20th year of his long and glorious reign, and is commemorated as a saint in the Irish calendar. St. Molling survived him 3 years, and St. Adamnan, so intimately connected with his reign, 10 years. The latter revisited Ireland in 697, under the short reign of Loingsech, and concerned himself chiefly in endeavoring to induce his countrymen to adopt the Roman rule, as to the tonsure and the celebration of Easter. On this occasion there was an important synod of the clergy under the presidency of Flann, Archbishop of Armagh, held at Tara. Nothing could be more natural than such an assembly in such a place at such a period. In every recorded instance the power of the clergy had been omnipotent in politics for above a century. St. Patrick had expurgated the old constitution. St. Ruadan's curse drove the kings from Tara. St. Columcille had established the independence of Alba and preserved the bardic order. St. Molling had abolished the Leinster tribute. If their power was irresistible in the 6th and especially in the 7th centuries, we must do these celebrated abbots and bishops the justice to remember that it was always exercised against the oppression of the weak by the strong, to mitigate the horrors of war, to uphold the right of sanctuary, the habeas corpus of that rude age, and for the maintenance and spread of sound Christian principles. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7. Kings of the 8th Century. The kings of the 8th century are Congal II, surnamed Kenmare, who reigned 7 years; Fergal, who reigned 10 years; Forgarta, Kenneth, Flaherty, respectively 1, 4, and 7 years; Hugh V, surnamed Allen, 9 years; Donald III, who reigned A.D. 739 to 759, 20 years; Neil II, surnamed Neil of the Showers, 7 years; and Donogh I, who reigned 31 years, A.D. 766 to 797. The obituaries of these kings show that we have fallen on a comparatively peaceful age, since of the entire 9, but 3 perished in battle. 1 retired to Armagh, and 1 to Iona, where both departed in the monastic habit. The others died either of sickness or old age. Yet the peaceful character of this century is but comparative, for in the first quarter, A.D. 722, we have the terrible Battle of Almain, between Leinster and the monarch, in which 30,000 men were stated to have engaged, and 7,000 to have fallen. The monarch, who had double the number of the Leinster prince, was routed and slain, apropos of which we have a bardic tale told, which almost transports one to the far east, the simple lives and awful privileges of the Hindu Brahmins. It seems that some of King Fergal's army, in foraging for their fellows, drove off the only cow of a hermit, who lived in seclusion near a solitary little chapel called Killin. The enraged recluse, at the very moment the armies were about to engage, appeared between them, regardless of personal danger, denouncing ruin and death to the monarch's forces, and in this case, as in others to be found in every history, the prophecy, no doubt, helped to produce its own fulfilment. The malediction of men dedicated to the service of God has often routed hosts as gallant as were marshalled on the field of Almain. Fergal's 2 immediate successors met a similar fate, death in the field of battle, after very brief reigns, of which we have no great events to record. Flaherty, the next who succeeded, after a vigorous reign of 7 years, withdrew from the splendid cares of a crown, and passed the long remainder of his life, 30 years, in the habit of a monk at Armagh. The heavy burthen which he had cheerfully laid down was taken up by a prince, who combined the twofold character of poet and hero. Hugh V, surnamed Allen, the son of Fergal, of whom we have just spoken, was the very opposite of his father in his veneration for the privileges of holy persons and places. His first military achievement was undertaken in vindication of the rights of those who were unable by arms to vindicate their own. Hugh Rowan, prince of the troublesome little principality of Ulidia, Down, though well stricken in years and old enough to know better, in one of his excursions had forcibly compelled the clergy of the country through which he passed to give him free quarters, contrary to the law everywhere existing. Congus, the primate, jealous of the exemptions of his order, complained of this sacrilege in a poetic message addressed to Hugh Allen, who, as a Christian and a prince, was bound to espouse his quarrels. He marched into the territory of the offender, defeated him in battle, cut off his head on the threshold of the church of Faughard, and marched back again, his host chanting a war song composed by their leader. In this reign died Saint Gerald of Mayo, an Anglo-Saxon bishop, and apparently the head of a colony of his countrymen, from whom that district is ever since called Mayo of the Saxons. The name, however, being a general one for strangers from Britain about that period, just as Dane became for foreigners from the Baltic in the next century, is supposed to be incorrectly applied, the colony being, it is said, really from Wales, of old British stock, who had migrated rather than live under the yoke of their victorious Anglo-Saxon kings. The descendants of these Welshmen are still to be traced, though intimately intermingled with the original Belgic and later Milesian settlers in Mayo, Sligo, and Galway, thus giving a peculiar character to that section of the country, easily distinguishable from all the rest. Although Hugh Allan did not imitate his father's conduct towards ecclesiastics, he felt bound by all ruling custom to avenge his father's death. In all ancient countries, the kinsmen of a murdered man were both by law and custom the avengers of his blood. The members of the Greek phratry, of the Roman phratria, or gens, of the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon guild, and of the medieval sworn commune, were all solemnly bound to avenge the blood of any of their brethren, unlawfully slain. So that the repulsive repetition of reprisals, which so disgusts the modern reader in our old annals, is by no means a phenomenon peculiar to the Irish state of society. It was in the Middle Age and in early times common to all Europe, to Britain and Germany, as well as to Greece and Rome. It was, doubtless, under a sense of duty of this sort that Hugh V led into Leinster a large army, A.D. 733, and the day of Athsened fully atoned for the day of Almain. 9,000 of the men of Leinster were left on the field, including most of their chiefs, the victorious monarch losing a son and other near kinsmen. 4 years later, he himself fell in an obscure contest near Kells, in the plain of Meath. Some of his quartrains have come down to us, and they breathe a spirit at once religious and heroic, such as must have greatly endeared the prince, who possessed it, to his companions in arms. We are not surprised, therefore, to find his reign a favourite epoch with subsequent bards and storytellers. The long and prosperous reign of Donald III succeeded, A.D. 739 to 759. He is almost the only one of this series of kings of whom it can be said that he commanded in no notable battle. The annals of his reign are chiefly filled with ordinary accidents and the obits of the learned. But its literary and religious records abound with bright names and great achievements, as we shall find when we come to consider the educational and missionary fruits of Christianity in the 8th century. While on a pilgrimage to Durrow, a famous Columbian foundation in Meath, and present King's County, Donald III departed this life, and in Durrow, by his own desire, his body was interred. Niall II, surnamed of the Showers, son to Fergal and brother of the warrior bard Hugh V, was next invested with the white wand of sovereignty. He was a prince less warlike and more pious than his elder brother. The sobriquet attached to his name is accounted for by a bardic tale, which represents him as another Moses, at whose prayer food fell from heaven in time of famine. Whatever showers fell or wonders were wrought in his reign, it is certain that after enjoying the kingly office for 7 years, Niall resigned, and retired to Iona, there to pass the remainder of his days in penance and meditation. 8 years he led the life of a monk in that sacred isle, where his grave is one of those of the 3 Irish kings, still pointed out in the cemetery of the kings. He is but one among several princes, his contemporaries, who had made the same election. We learn in this same century that Kellach, son of the king of Connacht, died in holy orders, and that Bec, prince of Ulidia, and Ardgul, son of a later king of Connacht, had taken the cross-staff of the pilgrim, either for Iona or Armagh, or some more distant shrine. Pilgrimages to Rome and to Jerusalem seem to have been begun even before this time, as we may infer from St. Adamnan's work on the situation of the holy places, of which Bede gives an abstract. The reign of Donogh I is the longest and the last among the kings of the 8th century, A.D. 776 to 797. The kings of Ireland had now not only abandoned Tara, but one by one the other royal residences in Meath as their usual place of abode. As a consequence, a local sovereignty sprung up in the family of O'Melaghlin, a minor branch of the ruling race. This house, developing its power so unexpectedly, and almost always certain to have the national forces under the command of a patron prince at their back, were soon involved in quarrels about boundaries, both with Leinster and Munster. King Donogh, at the outset of his reign, led his forces into both principalities, and without battle received their hostages. Giving hostages, generally the sons of the chiefs, was the usual form of ratifying any treaty. Generally also, the bishop of the district, or its most distinguished ecclesiastic, was called in as witness of the terms, and both parties were solemnly sworn on the relics of saints, the gospels of the monasteries or cathedrals, or the croziers of their venerated founders. The breach of such a treaty was considered a violation of the relics of the saint, whose name had been invoked, and awful penalties were expected to follow so heinous a crime. The hostages were then carried to the residence of the king, to whom they were entrusted, and while the peace lasted, enjoyed a parole freedom and every consideration due to their rank. If of tender age, they were educated with the same care as the children of the household, but when war broke out their situation was always precarious, and sometimes dangerous. In a few instances they had even been put to death, but this was considered a violation of all the laws, both of hospitality and chivalry. Usually, they were removed to some strong secluded fort, and carefully guarded as pledges to be employed, according to the chances and changes of the war. That Donogh preferred negotiation to war, we may infer by his course towards Leinster and Munster, in the beginning of his reign, and his kingly parley at a later period, A.D. 783, with Fiachna of Ulidia, son of that over-exacting Hugh Rowan, whose head was taken from his shoulders at the church door of Faughard. This kingly parley was held on an island off the Methian shore, called afterwards King's Island. But little good came of it. Both parties still held their own views, so that the satirical poets asked what was the use of the island when one party would not come upon the land, nor the other upon the sea. However, we needs must agree with King Donogh that war is the last resort, and is only to be tried when all other means have failed. Twice during this reign the whole island was stricken with panic, by extraordinary signs in the heavens, of huge serpents coiling themselves through the stars, of fiery bolts flying like shuttles from one side of the horizon to the other, or shooting downward directly to the earth. These atmospheric wonders were accompanied by thunder and lightning, so loud and so prolonged, that men hid themselves for fear in the caverns of the earth. The fairs and markets were deserted by buyers and sellers. The fields were abandoned by the farmers. Steeples were rent by lightning, and fell to the ground. The shingled roofs of churches caught fire and burned whole buildings. Shocks of earthquakes were also felt, and round towers and cyclopean masonry were strewn in fragments upon the ground. These visitations first occurred in the second year of Donogh, and returned again in 783, when, in the next decade, the first Danish descent was made on the coast of Ulster, A.D. 794, these signs and wonders were superstitiously supposed to have been the precursors of that far more terrible and more protracted visitation. The Danes at first attracted little notice, but in the last year of Donogh, A.D. 797, they returned in greater force, and swept rapidly along the coast of Meath. It was reserved for his successors of the following centuries to face the full brunt of this new national danger. But before encountering the fierce nations of the north, and the stormy period they occupy, let us cast back a loving glance over the world-famous schools and scholars of the last 2 centuries. Hitherto we have only spoken of certain saints in connection with high affairs of state. We must now follow them to the college and the cloister. We must consider them as founders at home and missionaries abroad. Otherwise, how could we estimate all that is at stake for Erin and for Christendom in the approaching combat with the devotees of Odin, the deadly enemies of all Christian institutions?